Welcome to a very special video, and one that I've wanted to do for a very long time. We're in one of my favorite places in the entire world, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway Museum. Now, sadly, you won't be able to come into this museum for 18 months, but it's for a good reason. This entire building, well, the inside of it anyway, is about to be renovated totally. It's going to be almost a completely new museum, and we're so excited for that to open in May of 2025. But I felt like it was extremely important to document this museum as it is, how it stands, and how it's been essentially since 1976 when it opened. This will be a great video, hopefully, for those of you who want to reminisce about how the museum used to be, or maybe some of those of you who will never get to experience the museum in this state. Now, I'm not going to walk through here alone because, frankly, who wants to listen to me for this long? And for that, I have a very special guest here on the channel and someone who I consider to be a close personal friend, Jason Vansickle, the curator of the IMS Museum. Now, Jason, it's important to note, because I mentioned it already, this was not originally the first museum, though it's the one that I think most people remember. Tell us a little bit about the museum origins.
Yeah, so some may be surprised to know that the IMS Museum is nearing our 70th anniversary up on the horizon. It started in 1956 as a smaller exhibition display to honor Wilbur Shaw, and really was spearheaded by Carl Kaiser, our first curator, and Tony Holman.
So, because of that, you guys have created a brand new exhibit that pays homage to the 1956 museum. Would you care to show me around it?
Yeah, let's go check it out.
Well, we're back in time now. We're back in 1956, Jason, and something that has always greeted museum goers since 1956, and something that I think people so heavily think of when they think of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway is this beautiful yellow car here, the Marmon Wasp. Tell us a little bit about this car for those of you who maybe don't know what it is.
Well, the Marmon Wasp, it was the inaugural Indianapolis 500 winner back in 1911 with driver Ray Haroon, and Carl Fischer and the founders and the participants really, you don't really know if they knew the significance of that race. It was a massive race, but it really started something that millions of race fans have cherished over the over 100 years of the race.
And it's so funny to look at this car and really see the origins of IndyCar racing in it. This car has Firestone tires. This car is a single-seater. This car has a rearview mirror, what many claim is the first rearview mirror ever used in the world of automobiles. You talked about how, of course, we can't have historical perspective when things are going on, but when did folks realize that this car was as important as it is?
I think what's special about this, when you look at the time in the race car, Marmon kind of retired from racing from a factory effort after this victory, and the car became a showpiece from there. And unlike a lot of cars that were kind of driven to oblivion or raced in different series later on in its life, this car was always a statement piece, an advertising piece for that. So it lived on under Marmon's ownership, and then the Holiday family ownership, and then actually went out to Rhode Island. And then when the museum opened in '56, it was on loan, and then shortly after that, the foundation acquired it. So it's been on display here at the Speedway since 1956.
So when we talk about the Indianapolis Motor Speedway and the progression of things, you think about 1956, rear-engine cars weren't even really a thinking point or a talking point. You've got a lot of front-engine cars here. What was kind of the thought process behind many of these cars that we see here in the museum? Why were they chosen to be displayed in 1956?
Well, I think obviously we owe that to our first curator, Carl Kaiser, who knew of these cars. He was a collector. The Junior 8 here was one of the early cars that he had in his collection even before the museum started, so it was easy to acquire those. But really the emphasis of the museum started after the tragic passing of Wilbur Shaw in '54, and Kaiser and Tony Holman got together, wanted to honor Wilbur in a way. Instead of doing a statue or sculpture, Tony mentioned starting a museum even back in 1946, when pretty much his first year of ownership. But it really took that unfortunate tragedy to honor Wilbur to build the museum portion of the administration building.
So I think it's important too when you talk about important figures here at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Carl Fischer is one that's brought up so often, and in fact this car predates not only the Indianapolis 500 but predates the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. I know this is one of your favorites. Tell me a little bit about it.
And I'm a big fan of Carl Fischer, and the Premier is my favorite car in the collection. It is a unique figure, and not to go in depth massively on this car. It's very high tech for its age. It's 1905. Fischer wanted to race it in the Gordon Bennett Cup, which was the prominent early road racing event overseas. He wanted to showcase what the American ingenuity could do because it was lacking against the European counterparts, which then you see that kind of facsimile into why he built the track and things like that a few years later in the early days of the 500. But it's a 923 cubic inch air-cooled overhead cam, hemispherical combustion chamber, total loss oiling system. It's a monster of a car, and what's unique about it was too heavy to race at the Vanderbilt Cup, which was a qualifier for the Gordon Bennett Cup. And you see all the holes drilled throughout the car, and that was a weight-saving apparatus feature, but it still was too heavy. So Fischer did race this at the State Fair Mile dirt track that we currently have still today. Unfortunately, there's really no racing on it anymore, but that has a long history of racing, and he averaged just under 60 miles an hour in this car at night. And Fischer had astigmatism in his eyes, and this was way before he bought his first pair of glasses. So in today's consideration or terms, he probably would have been classified as legally blind, but he was racing a race car at that time. Different era, different story, but it just makes just one of the numerous stories of why Fischer's so popular and kind of amazing to study.
Yeah, and obviously we have a lot to thank him for. I think neither of us would have a career if it wasn't for Carl Fischer. In 1920 or 1923, you had Dusenberg. In 2023, you have Dallara. The Dusenberg name was so synonymous with the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and of course, this car went on to international fame, not just here in the United States.
Yeah, this is a good example of an early 1920s car. Dusenberg and Harry Miller, which we'll talk about a little bit later, were the two prominent builders, where Harry Miller you could probably equate with Roger Penske in the way of precision and engineering and cutting edge and things like that. Dusenberg was a little bit more scrappy, but they made some great high-tech cars, fast cars. This car was entered in the 1921 French Grand Prix, which pretty much shocked the world when Jimmy Murphy and his riding mechanic Ernie Olsen won that event. Fast forward a year later, Murphy acquired the car from the Dusenberg brothers, swapped the Dusenberg Straight 8 for a Miller Straight 8, sat on pole, and then won from pole, becoming the first driver to win from pole. And the Dusenberg name, if you will, would go on to win in 1924, 1925, and 1927. And then their passenger car history is its own chapter in the saga. So this is right at the time when they moved from New Jersey to Indianapolis. But the Dusenberg name has a lot of significance in post-1920 roots here in Indianapolis.
So one thing that we, don't really have so much anymore, but back in the past, particularly the 40s and on up, you had different configurations of race cars. We think now of a rear-engined, rear-wheel drive machine, but this is a front-wheel drive Indy car. Explain the Blue Crowns, because these were extremely popular race cars.
Yeah, they were unique. Coming out of the war, you really had the Blue Crowns and the Novis as the two quote-unquote new cars, especially with the Novi in 46. But with Lou Moore and his strategy, and Maury Rose, the driver, and Bill Holland, the co-driver, these cars really dominated the race, and with Maury Rose winning in 1947-48 back-to-back, and then Bill Holland winning the 49 race. They were the dominant car, and unique, obviously, with the 270 Offie in it, and that front-wheel drive component. It's a bit of a beast to drive, and whether it's today or back in anger during the race.
We don't have to go in too depth into the turbine thing because so many people talk about the turbine or turbine, tomato, tomato.
Yep.
But you know, this car predates the Paxton car that was brought here by Andy Granatelli by 10 years and was in the museum 10 years before that car arrived. Did Carl Fischer and all those folks, did Tony Holman have a crystal ball and saw the future of Indianapolis?
You know, I don't know. This car is interesting in the fact that it had a life before the turbine. It finished runner-up as a Granatelli car, entered car in with Jim Rathman in 1952. And then Granatelli eventually sold it. It became a Firestone test car. But then the Strategic Air Command purchased the car, and in what they called their hobby shop, they put this Boeing 202 turbine in it. And during opening day of 1955, Henry Banks drove around the speedway in demonstration laps. It was never meant to qualify for the race, but it did run demonstration laps around the month of May at that time. And to your point, by the time 67 rolled by with the side mount, you had this car in the museum while another turbine was running and competing for the victory.
It's absolutely amazing how sometimes it seems like at this place, just coincidences aren't really a thing. It always seems to all work together and come together. And another major factor in the Indianapolis 500 are the fantastic finishes. And the very first fantastic finish, I would say, is 1912. And we have the car here, the winner, Joe Dawson.
Yeah, the early days of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway and 500, Indiana-built automobiles were a competing factor. And the National, another Indianapolis-based company, Arthur Newby was not only a founder of the Speedway, but the owner of National before his parlay into the track world, automobile track world. But this race really was dominated by Ralph De Palma. He led 196 laps, and the story is iconic, where unfortunately he threw a rod in the engine, and then Ralph and his riding mechanic, Rupert Jeffkins, had to push the car, thinking that they could at least get it to the pit road. There's kind of some debate on if they were trying to get it fixed or if they thought they were on their final lap. But onward of that, Dawson, who was 4 laps down at that time, made up his laps and then would lead just a little bit of the 500 and win. So this spectacular finish, obviously. And then it has connections to 2011 because when Dan Weldon won in that dramatic fashion, he broke a 99-year record that Joe Dawson held for the least distance led for the winner. And I don't think that record's going to be broken unless there's another spectacular finish in the future.
I think we're looking forward to spectacular finishes. Another thing that's kind of a footnote in IMS history, but it's been so important, have been motorcycle races. It was one of the original type of motorsport here, and obviously we also had the MotoGP come 100 years later. So why did they decide to put a motorcycle in the first museum?
Well, this is an interesting, it's in some cases people call it a BITSA, meaning it's here to honor Cannonball Baker, who won the first motor-powered race, if you will, the motorcycle race weekend. And unfortunately, he passed in the late 1950s. There was a gentleman who had various parts of a similar type Indian motorcycle that Cannonball raced back in 1909 and assembled it and donated it for Cannonball Baker's honor. And, you know, Cannonball is his own fantastic person. Obviously, the Cannonball Run is named after him. He made multiple transcontinental trips via motorcycle or automobile. He did run the Indianapolis 500 in 1922. That's another interesting part. So there is a 500 connection, but we don't have it. It's in storage because of the upcoming renovation, but we do have his final transcontinental Indian motorcycle from the 30s. That's part of the collection too.
Wow. So one thing that we have come to take for granted in modern IndyCar racing is a rear-engined race car. And so many folks, if you say, what's the first rear-engine car to race here? There's going to be one of two answers. It's going to be the Cooper Climax in 1961 or the Lotus that came in 1963. But I'm looking at a rear-engine car that is much, much older than those.
Yeah, we mentioned Harry Miller earlier, and this is a bit of his last hurrah, if you will. He had so much success in the 20s here at the Speedway, bringing these innovative innovative designs and things like that with his team. But in 1938, he was commissioned by Gulf Oil to build a rear engine vehicle. If you squint, you do see a lot of auto union at the time. I mean, you really have to squint, but you can kind of see Miller was kind of looking across if he was in a classroom, said he was kind of looking across and seeing what the other guys were doing. But unfortunately, this car really did not have success. It did make the 500, but the other pre and post-war, but not this car in particular, but the sister car kind of has a bit of a negative association because it was the car that started the infamous 1941 garage fire.
Oh, geez.
So, which that car was consumed in that. One of, I think, the 2 or 3 cars that were actually damaged in that fire. But this is interesting. It's got a slant 6 Miller supercharged engine, all-wheel drive, just a unique high-tech car for its time, but its success didn't parlay into other people making that jump until the rear engine revolution in the 60s.
Isn't that funny how that works? This is a turbocharged 6-cylinder rear engine car, similar to what we're running today, except for not at all.
Oh, yeah. Well, yes, yeah. Well, supercharged, so it's a little different.
It's blown,
Yeah,
we'll put it that way.
Blown.
Cummins Diesel.
Yep.
This is always such an important aspect of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Now, you guys don't own this car, but it is an important footnote in the history. Combustion engine cars are such a common thing, or gasoline-powered race cars, but this was not.
This is an interesting car in a variety of different ways, and it has a lot of firsts. This, along with the Vukovich Roadster of 52, were both designed body-wise by Frank Curtis, so they both have the designation of the first roadsters to run. This obviously has a lot more, much lower profile even than the already low Roadster of the time. It's the first. We did talk about turbo supercharging. This is the first turbocharged car to run the Indianapolis 500. But that unique diesel power, Klesse Cummins has a connection to the 500. He was actually on the Marmon team in 1911 with Ray Haroon, and later on would obviously in 1930 do the nonstop car, enter 2 cars in 34, and then another car in 1950 before that. The museum does own those 4 vehicles, but this one's still owned by Cummins Inc. And we're happy to have this car because it was part of the original museum, and it actually, along with the first 6 that we have here, greeted race fans May of 1956 when the museum opened.
Oh my gosh! And you think about turbo diesels, while they didn't have success, or the success that maybe they wanted here at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, eventually at Le Mans, they won several races in a row between Audi and Peugeot. So very interesting. And then we got the last 2 cars here, at least in 1956. We've heard the name Miller a few times. Talk about that.
So this is a really unique car because it has a kind of a long history. It started as the Detroit Special in the late 20s. It's front-wheel drive, which is unique. Obviously, the Junior 8 was the first front drive to run the Indianapolis 525, but really by 29 to the early 30s, front drive cars were winning the 500. This won the 1932 500. But then Harry Hartz, who was the prominent car owner, one of the prominent car owners at the time, acquired the chassis. His first Hartz Miller Special was destroyed, so he retrofitted the chassis, added this body. Fred Frame would go on to win the 500 in 1932, but Ted Horn would go on after Frame had the car and rattle off like 3 top 5 finishes in this car before it was kind of phased out of competition. But it ran after the war too. That's another thing. Obviously it ran before the war and had its success, but it was competing. And this was actually Carl Kaiser's first car of his collection. So you can kind of argue that this car, along with the Maserati, started the museum.
And of course, the Maserati. I mean, this is the quintessential kind of early Indy car. This is the car that so many people, including Speedway President Doug Bowles, think is the best Indy car of all time. I mean, what is so special about this racing machine? What draws people to it?
Well, I think the thing is, it checks a lot of boxes. It looks great. It's streamlined. In the late 30s, even with Indy cars, you started seeing where like the Fred Frame car, the body's on top of the frame. you're starting to encapsulate the frame rails, at least with body work that you see on the side there. That supercharged straight 8 sounds great. That when it's idling, when it's running. But then I think the legacy too was being the first back-to-back winner with Wilbur Shaw, his second and third win, and Wilbur's connection of saving the speedway later on. You know, he didn't have that mindset when he was racing, but the fact that the longevity too. This car ran in some capacity in the 500 or practice all the way up to after the war period. I think like Tony Bettenhausen, Duke Neyland would all take the rookie test in this car. And obviously with Rex Mays driving the car too after the war, sitting on the front row with it. I mean, it is a very special car, and it was actually competing against like the Blue Crowns after the war.
Oh my gosh. And we talk about longevity today with the current cars. It's so amazing to think about how long some of these cars were in service. It's just unbelievable.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And the other thing too I didn't mention, you know, in 41 when Wilbur was leading the race and unfortunately had that wheel collapse, you know, this could have been, there's a bit of a bad luck in threes here. You know, we haven't had a 3 consecutive winner, whether it's the Brickyard or the 500. And this kind of started that trend, if you will, with Shaw and Louis Meyer battling, and then, Shaw leading in 41 and then suffering that collapse.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, you think about the dominance. You know, I don't think fans would put up with that kind of dominance these days, but it made Wilbur Shaw a hero back then. Well, that's 1956, but there are 2 other exhibits with cars. Let's check those out, Jason.
Yeah, let's go look at them.
Be on the lookout for part 2 of 3 of my museum walkthrough, where Jason and I will go through some of the secret cars out of the infamous IMS Museum basement.